I did a series of posts on building a aggregate measurement so that you could use that to publish data to the entity store and use that in business intelligence. Now there's another object, if we have a look in the data model, which is called the Aggregate Data Entity. So how does this work? Well, this object is really used for exposing your measured data via OData. So essentially providing an external interface to access that data. Now I've got my measure here, and if we have a look at the measure, we'll see that the usage here is specified as in memory real time. You'll see that there's another option on here as staged entity store. So if I put the option on the measure to be staged entity store, then it can only be used with the entity store, meaning published to the entity store database. If I put in memory real time, which is the default, then I can access it both by publishing it to the entity store and also accessing it via a service call or OData call to that entity. So let's have a look at building the aggregate data entity. So I can't do this without first having a measure. So I've already built the measure, so that's the key here. So I can go up to analytics, and then I've got aggregate data entity, and so from here I can say that this is my OG cust trans ag entity, for example, and then we'll say OK. Now the first things that we want to have a look at is how this entity is accessed. So if we have a look at the properties, I'm at the top level here. The properties is public. I'll have to set this to no, set this to yes if I want to access this via OData. If I don't set this to yes, then I'm not going to be able to access it. So then I want to give it a name. So the name is how we're going to find it when we have a look at the OData feed, or the data feed, for example. So this is going to be my name. So let's say cust trans, and then we'll say our aggregate entity. So I've given it a collection name and then the specific entity name, so it just matches there. Now while I'm setting properties on the object, I want to find a property here called the primary key, and this is a field that you can type in. So I'm going to type it in here. Now at this stage it's not used, it's not a lookup, but there is a key in the object that we're going to create, and this is used for filtering later. So let's have a look at doing that when we get forward. Alright, so now we've set up those, let's go and populate our data source. So we have a data source here, and what we're going to specify is now our measure. So the measure that we created earlier is what we're going to put in here. And the name of this is OG cust trans measure. Now you could use any measure. This is just the one that I built in the previous videos. So that's our measure. Then we'll see that this gets populated through here, and I can see my details in terms of measures and dimensions that we can see from that measure that we'd built earlier. So from the measure, then we can populate the field. So the fields node on the aggregate entity is then what's going to be exposed to the outside world. So you may not want to expose all measures, and that's up to you in terms of what you want to expose, but in this case I'm going to just use all the same. So transaction count, amount, sum. I'm going to use the customer number as an attribute, and then the description as an attribute as well. So just essentially those 4 fields there. So that's my fields. Let's have a look at creating the key. So the first thing I'm going to do is give it a name, and this name is what we set on the property before. So I'm typing in that name, so it has to match this property that we typed in earlier. So in this case I used the name OG customer, so this is the name that needs to match there. Alright, so now we need to add a field underneath this, and this is going to be the key field, which is going to be our customer number. So I'm going to specify that here. So once we've done that, essentially our aggregate entity is built or created. Now there's obviously other properties that we can specify. We could use field groups and those sort of things in here, but this is the basic details to get the aggregate entity work. Now the key things that we want to check is that it is public. If it's not public, then I'm not going to be able to see it. And then the other one is the measure that we've based this on needs to be in memory real time, otherwise we're not going to be able to see this as well by the data feed. So I'm just going to build my model. So this is going to take a little while to build, so I'm going to build and synchronize, and so I'll set this off and then I'll pause the video while it's building. Alright, our build is finished. That means that now I'm using a single box, which means we've built and deployed. So the next thing is that we can grab the URL, and so I'm going to go and grab the URL of our installation. So then I can take that, and let's open up Power BI Desktop again. And let's go ahead and we can get our data. Now this is where we can use the OData feed, and so this will allow us to have some content that's going to be accessed via the live service. Now this is obviously different to the entity store because we're going straight to the transactional database versus going to the entity store, which is of course staged data. So there's obviously performance differences between this. So I'm going to put my URL in here, but I'm going to put the keyword which is data. So if I use data, then it's going to go and look at the list here and then show us the entities. So I'm going to go and specify my organizational accounts. I'm just going to go and sign in here because of course we're accessing the data, therefore we need to sign in. So I'll just pause the video while I sign in. Alright, I've signed in, so I'm going to say connect, and then it's going to access, and then it's going to do an inquiry. So I'll just pause the video while it does its inquiry, and we'll see that it's downloading the data, and then we're going to display the details. Alright, so what we'll see is a list of entities that are exposed that I can access via OData, and so we could look through the list, but of course I can filter, and so I'm going to filter, and so now we'll see that we have the OG custrans and then we have the OG customers. So these are essentially the objects, in our case the custrans is the measure, aggregate measure, because we'll see that the measure fields are here, amount sum, transaction count, for example. So I can now hit load, and then that's going to load up, so I can put a chart in there for a visualization. Then I can pick our amount sum and then do that by customer number, for example. So now I can do that analysis through the service. So again, this is going off the real-time transactional data in the application versus going through the entity store. So obviously differences in terms of performance, data accessibility, and things like that. So something to consider. But that's a quick look, and again, this case we're using the OData feed, and we can do that via the aggregate entity. So the aggregate data entity is essentially the object to expose a measure via the service call. Now it is a data entity, but you can't use this for import and export purposes. So it's really just an object to expose the measure. So even though you'll see, for example, some properties on here that says data management, it doesn't mean that you can use this to import and export. So these properties won't take effect, for example. So if you're importing and exporting, you'll still need to use your data entities or composite entities, for example. So that's a quick look at building an aggregate data entity to expose a measure.